when we are looking at the stock market, when we are looking at social relationships, this is the beginning of the concept of not only how to understand where things are by the patterns that they take and to be able to predict the patterns they will fall into, but it's the beginning of being able to manipulate these using waveforms, a waveform understanding, to create patterns that change in unpredictable manner as far as looking at the structural aspect of it. This is where we change from simply being Isaac Asimov's Foundation, where we say, here is what the future will hold based on the analysis of the structural items, that then seems only open to chaos to change that pattern. And we begin to become Second Foundation, where we say we don't see just the structural progression that can be affected by chaos. We actually see the underlying waveforms that create these moments that appear to be the space-time moment particles that appear to define the structure, and we see the waveforms that create them. We can alter those. We can change them by a small application of force at the right moment with the right moments with the right phasing and the right intensity to get the end results we want. Definitely a lot more work has to be done here, but it's really beginning to come together quite well in terms of the relationships going on at that magic moment when we see things jumping limit lines versus the waveform patterns when we see sliding scales as we're beginning to move things and change their context as opposed to changing their nature. This discussion has within it the seeds of being able to change context or nature in any situation with the minimum necessary applied force or the minimum necessary duration of repetition. Also, see references in psychology on reinforcement, in extinction, learning, interference in cognitive processes of learning, positive interference and negative interference, retrograde and antegrade interference. Also look at it in terms of memory, when things come bubbling up to the surface that we recall. Look at it toward attribution error and other passive observations of our environment, as well as the active ones of manipulation. Cross-reference with these things, and you'll find applications equally valid. Well, final quickie thought for today. I'm rushing to get ready to go to Screenplay Systems to view a movie with Chris that we have to analyze for Dramatica, but I have to get this documented. Everything I've been talking about here is my final work on the model of the unified field theory. In fact, between the coiling rope examples I used in my earlier tape, which deal with the observer, and dealing with the macroscopic and microscopic natures compared to the observer in this discussion, that takes care of the observational side of the unified field theory. And in the relationship between the linear application of force, the frequency at which it is applied and the regularity at which it is applied in comparison to the waveform that it is applied to, that completes the observational side of the unified field theory, the non-observer side. The model is now complete. All we need is the math to describe it, but there are some predictions that can be made already. For one thing, because of the fact that we're talking about everything having a waveform to it, in addition to its apparent solidity, that the nature of that solidity changes by nature over a waveform that could be long or short. We look at some objects that have long waveforms, such as a coiled spring, and even if nothing is done to unwind the spring, the prediction of this model of unified field is that over time, the energy contained within that spring would dissipate down to nothing, so eventually the spring would have no energy at all. It would still be coiled, but if you took off the stop that was holding it coiled, it would just stay there coiled. It would be frozen in that position, or that would be its normal position now. In other words, there'd be a half-life to the energy stored in the coiled spring. Clearly, the energy in the spring dissipating is going somewhere, and where it's going is longitudinally, because it's applying what's apparently a steady force to the other areas, even though we have applied a force to coil the spring itself now becomes a force that's being applied in a steady manner because the energy is there continually, and it will dissipate into the molecules of the spring itself, giving them more energy. It's a tie-in between the strong and weak forces of the universe as to what happens. And similarly, if you have a spring or a piece of metal that has lost all its energy, that is wound up and has lost its energy, eventually it will regain it again. Another prediction of the theory is not only do you have radioactive decay, where the energy of one sort is being dissipated longitudinally through the continuous application of a force, but also where it would work in reverse, meaning that if you have an element like lead, eventually lead will become radioactive at another point in its existence. Why don't we see lead becoming radioactive frequently? Simply because lead in and of itself has a much longer waveform than uranium does or plutonium. And as a result, in that longer waveform, it takes much longer for it to transmute. But it does transmute. That's why each of the elements can be looked at not as having a different nature, and not so much in terms of quantum shells, but in terms of its wavelength, in terms of its frequency. Each element has a different frequency, and as that frequency is changed over the long term by other forces that are applied, they can either degrade themselves, terrible word to use, down to a less energetic state like lead, or increase their energy, much as leaving a coiled spring, it would eventually lose all of its energy. Taking a piece of metal that is in a coil shape but has no energy, eventually it will contract. It will create energy by virtue of the realignment of the particles within it. How long these waves are, that's where we tie into chaos theory, is that it appears to be chaotic in long wave patterns because we don't only see one instance of it. We never really see the ongoing repeating cycles. They're way too long for us to perceive, and only by virtue of the fact that we see this one instance, it appears to be chaotic, an exception to the rule. But if we were to observe for billions of years, or maybe billions of years, we'd be able to ultimately see that it is cyclic, and that these things that appear to be chaotic are completely ordered from a waveform perspective. In any event, all the pieces there for the model of unified field have now been completed. What remains is to couch it all in mathematical terms that would be acceptable to Western science. My fear is that because we're dealing with one dimension more, with other functions and perspectives we have not seen before, that only by using the new functions we're developing for quadranometry, when we're working with mental relativity, will we be able to fully describe the system, because it can't be described from a linear perspective. It must be described from a combination of linear and the holistic. The linear has been well documented in Western science. The holistic has never really had anything developed to describe that relativistic nature other than using linear tools. So by adding two new relativistic tools, two new functions, to create a total of 8 functions in quadranometry as opposed to the 6 basic functions of trigonometry, we add that final step that linearity can't get to, the relativistic nature, but it seems to violate a lot of what is accepted as being appropriate in Western science. So the mathematical proof may require first getting the scientific community to accept the necessity of stepping beyond linearity, stepping beyond nonlinearity into a completely holistic, relativistic, field-oriented perception of things, and add that to the linear understanding to then have the symbology we need to describe mathematically what's going on in the model that I've verbalized over the last few tapes. We'll see what happens, but the model is now complete. From our four-dimensional perspective, from our view of seeing things three-dimensional and operating within 4 dimensions, the most that we can understand about the interrelationship between the forces and the materials that we observe is described by this model, and it completes the unified field theory.